Welcome to this joint Authors Allowed UK and CILIP event to launch and celebrate Libraries Week. I'm Annie Everall, Director of Authors Allowed UK, and can I introduce Naomi Cooper, who is somewhere on my screen, who's my co-director of Authors Allowed, and Bev Humphrey is on tech duty tonight. And we have Natalie Jones from CILIP, who is here as well. She can perhaps give a wave too. It's fantastic to see so many of you here tonight. We have about 160 people registered, which is brilliant. As I say, we are really pleased to be working in partnership with CILIP on this My Library, My Books and Me celebration, which is launching Libraries Week. It's been good fun working with them. I think libraries are the lifeblood of our communities, and I don't think this has ever been more apparent than during lockdown, when people needed access to reading materials and children definitely needed access to stories. And our library services across the UK rose magnificently and innovatively to the challenge, and I think I want us to celebrate that too. For me personally, libraries have always been important, and they've always had a really big impact on my life. From my visits to the children's library in Gloucester City, where I'm from, with my mom when I was a child, to the absolute desperate, couldn't wait to reach 12 and get my adult library ticket for the adult library in Gloucester, which was in a separate building. At age 15, I got a job with Gloucester City Libraries on a Thursday evening in Tuffley Community Library and all day Saturday at the main City Library in Gloucester. And I met two inspirational librarians there, two guys called Malcolm Tarling and David Wrigglesworth. And they showed me what being a librarian was all about and the value that a library has for its community. And that was me hooked. And it led to a degree in librarianship and a career in children's librarianship in Birmingham and in Derbyshire until I worked with Naomi and we set up Authors Allowed. There are a great deal of books that have had a real impact on my life, and they form stepping stones to where I am today. And so I'm so looking forward to hearing our speakers share their books with us tonight. But we're going to start, before I introduce Anthony McGowan to you and ask him to share his favourite childhood book or library, I want to start the evening off with a lovely poetic contribution from Stuart Henderson, the poet Stuart Henderson, which for me sums up the magic of libraries and librarians and stories. Over to you, Bev.
Hello, my name is Stuart Henderson and I'm a poet. And to celebrate Libraries Week and the Express Your Shelf project, I thought, I'll read you my poem, Somewhere in the Library, which not only pays tribute to our wonderful librarians who serve us in our communities and in our schools, but also in the poem, I refer to some of my favourite children's books which have influenced me as a poet. Somewhere in the library. Somewhere in the library, there are fierce and friendly beasts. Dragons, cowardly lions, enjoying midnight feasts. Somewhere in the library, there are whirlpools and lagoons, coves and crags and picnics with pop and macaroons. Somewhere in the library, there are smugglers' hidden caves and voyages and shipwrecks where adventures come in waves. Somewhere in the library, there looms a gruffalo and twits and gangster grannies and a wardrobe full of snow, where the White Witch turns the pages, her icy fingers vexed, as Voldemort is reading what happens to him next. Somewhere in the library, down a whizzing country road, an amphibian with driving gloves, the hapless Mr. Toad. There's a stag and railway children, all present and correct, while underneath the floorboards, the borrowers collect. But somewhere in the library, there is someone very wise. Her title is librarian, which is really a disguise, for she's a gatherer of magic and a confidant of elves, whose legends she has catalogued and filed on ship-shaped shelves. And she knows 1,000 sagas and 10,000 tales. She's heard the yarns of hobbits and the ocean dreams of whales. So, let me share her mystery, one secret so sublime, her special prayer that starts each day goes, once upon a time.
I thought that was a really lovely way to start our evening off and celebrate our wonderful libraries and librarians. So, on to our panel of fantastic authors and speakers. And our first speaker tonight is author Anthony McGowan. Anthony's the winner of the 2020 Philip Carnegie Medal for his incredible book, Lark, the final book in the Truth of Things series. Brock was longlisted in 2014 and Rook was shortlisted in 2018 and he won in 2020. He's the author of a range of novels for children and young adults, including The Knife That Killed Me, which was also turned into a movie and longlisted for the Carnegie Medal, Henry Tudor, Hello Darkness, the Bear Bum Gang series, Project X series, and the Donut Diaries series. He's also written books for adults. So over to you, Anthony, to share with us your favourite books or libraries.
Hello. Well, very nice to be here. Love the poem to start off there. So if any of you have read Lark or the other books in the Truth Things series, you'll know where I'm from. It's a small one-horse town in between Leeds and York called Sherburn in Elmet. And I grew up there in the 1970s. And my background was kind of, I suppose, lower middle class. My parents were both nurses. And although both my parents read books, our house was not full of books. It wasn't one of those houses where there's shelves of books. There was a set of children's encyclopedias. And then also a set of Dickens that my dad had got from a junk shop, which were never touched. So it wasn't a house full of books, but it was a background where people read. And my main obsession when I was quite a small boy was facts. I wanted my head stuffed with facts. And the facts I most craved were facts about war, about aeroplanes and tanks and battles, but also facts about the natural world, which was and is an obsession of mine. And I remember being taken by my mum to the library in Sherburn. Now, Sherburn is not an interesting place in many ways. Well, it's kind of weird and quirky, but it's not there's no reason why anyone who wasn't from there would ever go to Sherburn. But in my mind, one building looms large, and that's the village library. So I was kind of brought up in a kind of scraggy little barrack type house where nothing quite worked, and it was all a bit shabby. And also there were 5 kids in this quite small house. And the Sherburn Library was this place of calm and refuge. I still remember the beautiful parquet flooring and just that sense that everything kind of clicked into place. Everything was polished and beautiful. But I was taken there to find books to feed my obsession with animals and war. And the book that I got most obsessed with was a book called The Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats. This is between the age of sort of 7 and 9. I read it over and over again. And still, I reckon that about half of the stuff in my head comes from from, in fact, this book, the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats, which I borrow over and over again with my children's card. And I mean, years later, I went on the internet and found another copy. I didn't steal this copy from the Sherborne Library. But still, you know, going through it, it's so evocative to suddenly be taken back to those times of being a small boy and needing to find out which man-killing tiger killed the most people and how many people. It's a Chumpawat tiger, killed 453 people. So that was my first big obsession, the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats. But then a little bit later after that, I had a school teacher at my junior school called Miss Marning. And for some reason, although I'd never, I'm age now, maybe 9, going on for 10, I'd never read any fiction at all. It just wasn't really part of my mental furniture. And Miss Marnie, for some reason, gave me a copy of The Lord of the Rings, the first volume, The Fellowship of the Ring. And I just didn't quite know what a novel was or how to read a novel. I learned how to read a novel by reading The Lord of the Rings. And she gave me the first volume, but then after that I had to go to the local library again, to Sherborne Library, to get the rest. And the edition I read was this very beautiful edition here, which again in later life I bought. So I'd read The Fellowship of the Ring. I got from the local library The Two Towers and The Return of the King. And reading it probably took me 3 years. You know, it was a long, slow process of me trying to understand what fiction meant. But by the time I'd finished the Lord of the Rings, I was a different kind of little boy, maybe no longer quite so obsessed with animal facts and war, but with the stuff of fiction. And I've, from that point on, the kind of kid who read fiction and might one day go on to write it. But I mean, the beauty of my little local library was that you could kind of get to know the entire collection. It was almost richer because of its smallness. You could understand the whole thing, and so I would work my way along the shelves in that way that obsessive young readers do. I couldn't read quickly enough, trying to consume the world of literature, and so almost by mistake, I then came across the third and final book I'm going to talk about, which was she's now fallen slightly out of fashion, but back in the 70s and early 80s, she was quite a big thing. Someone called Dorothy Dunnett. A brilliant writer of historical fiction. She's written 2 great series. The first was about Limond, a guy called Limond, set in the Tudor period. And these books were, I probably read them when I was between maybe 15, 16 and 19. Incredibly complex. The language was dense and intricate. The world she summoned up was strange and powerful. And I just got so engrossed in these books. So again, it was this, that the library gave that transition from one world into another. And I was talking to my daughter a couple of months ago about the books that I read when I was her age. She's 17. And she and I mentioned that these Limond books, which again I hadn't read in 30 years, and she asked to read them. So I went to I'm now a member of the London Library, and I got her the whole Limond sequence from the London Library, and she's halfway through it already and equally enthralled. So weirdly, that kind of baton's been passed down the generations. So to kind of conclude, what my local library did for me was fill my mind with wonder and turn me from that curious boy who could have been almost anything into the kind of boy who was then obsessed with books, who read books and went on to write them. But I almost think the second half of that equation is the least important. That what that gave me was the greatest gift of all, which was turning me into a reader. Because as soon as you discover books, then you're never bored again for the rest of your life. You never run out of books to read. So okay, that's me, my library, and my book world. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Being a great lover of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I understand that that sense of excitement when you start reading it. So thanks very much. Our next author to share her love of books and libraries with us is Jasbinder Bilan. And according to family stories, Jasvinder was born in a stable in the foothills of the Himalayas. And until she was a year old, she lived on a farm inhabited by a grumpy camel and a monkey called Omar before moving to the UK. She graduated from Bath Spa University, where the seeds of her amazing story were nurtured, and that her bond with her grandmother was the inspiration for Aisha and the Spirit Bird, which was the winner of the Costa Children's Book Award for 2019 and shortlisted for the Waterstones Children's Book Prize in 2020 and longlisted for the Jalak Prize 2020. So can I hand over to you, Jasvinder? And I'm looking forward to hearing your favourite books and stories.
Growing up, libraries were hugely important to me. My family lived in Nottingham, right in the very centre of the city. And I grew up not in a house full of books, but in a house full of stories. And we'd sort of gather for big family dinners, and my uncles and aunts, we would all kind of tell stories, and I think that's where the sort of love of stories first sort of came. And so they would tell stories about growing up in India, stories about our the wild monkey Omar, who adopted our family, so, you know, those sort of times were really kind of happy memories for me. And my grandma, my Margie, who's been the inspiration for a lot of the stories that I have written, and particularly for Asher and the Spirit Bird, she was the one that would always tell us bedtime stories. So have very kind of fond memories of growing up with stories, kind of like family stories. But it was like my dad who made sure that we were members of our local library. And so I kind of remember really clearly, there are 6 of us all together. So it was a very kind of busy, boisterous household. And he took off the 3 sort of eldest ones because the others were a little bit too young. And we went for I remember, you know, it's a really kind of nice trip because you were being taken somewhere special. And that was the day that we joined the library. And the sort of what I kind of found was that although I really kind of loved stories and really, really enjoyed writing stories when I was growing up, I wasn't quite sure about the connection between stories and the books that I found in the library kind of lined up along all the shelves. And I remember being really kind of amazed, you know, that you kind of entered this building and there were so many books there kind of full of stories. And I think kind of growing up in the 70s, I think it was a time when we didn't really have author visits. I don't ever remember an author coming into my school. And so I sort of was a little bit confused about how these stories actually came into the books. And I didn't really imagine that anybody sat down and wrote these stories. And it sort of seemed like it was more something magical that had happened, because every time you opened a book, you would discover a story. And I guess, you know, the stories in books are a kind of magic for me, and I think for all of us who have these books that we absolutely love. And I was always drawn to the magical stories in the library. I kind of, I had a very vivid imagination and was a really kind of dreamy little girl. So I was always drawn to the magical stories. And one of my favourite books was, I'm just going to hold it up now, was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And one of the reasons why I love this book was that as we all know, the children went through a wardrobe to a magical land. And I think growing up in the 70s, I think lots and lots of people had these big Victorian wardrobes. So I kind of felt immediately, you know, that this story, I connected with it. And just like Lucy, when she first goes into the wardrobe, I used to kind of rifle through the clothes, and my mum had these faux fur 70s coats and kind of like going through it. And I really, really thought that I was going to find Narnia one day, and used to kind of go in quite regularly, trying and trying, and you know, it was just a real sort of power of the imagination. And I really honestly remember believing that one day I was actually going to be able to find Narnia, or somewhere, you know, more exciting than Narnia if I kept trying. So yeah, so this was definitely a book that I kind of went back to again and again. And one of my other favourite books, I remember, was this beautiful illustrated book of Greek myths and legends. And that was the book that I kind of remember borrowing over and over again, kind of wearing out my little sort of paper membership card. And I just loved, you know, that sort of I like drawing as well, so there was a real connection in that particular book between the drawings and the stories. And I just kind of loved the fact that they blended these kind of human lives and those of amazing gods and goddesses. So that was a particular book that I really, really liked. And I think kind of going back to libraries, they were so important as a way into a world of reading. I mean, obviously at school you were there were books in school, but it wasn't the same. And I think it was just that sort of sense of independence, and the fact that, you know, the library was there for everybody. It didn't really matter if your parents could afford to buy you books, or, you know, I never remember my parents kind of taking me to bookshops, but they definitely took me to libraries because, you know, that was a real opportunity for you to find a book that was really special for you. And it was kind of like a way of going into another world. So if you anything that was kind of going on for you that you were unhappy about, because, you know, that as a child there's always things that are perhaps kind of upset you, like little sibling rivalries or whatever, or little sort of upsets, and you knew that, you know, this place was a place where you could find a book that would take you away, could take you anywhere, which I found really heartening and comforting. And sort of later on, one of my favourite libraries, I don't know if anybody's been up there or kind of like it as well, is Manchester Central Library. And oh, well, I was a student there, and it's the most beautiful building. And I found it really, you know, it kind of took me back to being a child, because strangely for a library, it's circular. So that meant that every little noise is echoed. So I would like just tap on my table or like shuffle my chair a bit, and just to kind of hear the echo, which was quite good fun and kind of brings out the child in people. And the just sort of finally, I've been lucky enough to take part in a few of the Nottingham City of Literature projects and events, and I'm really excited because they are planning and building a library, and I think, I might be wrong, but I think it's going to be the biggest library, it's specifically children's library, and I think it's the biggest children's library in Europe. Definitely in the UK, maybe in Europe, but I won't put my hand on my heart to say that, but I think it might be. And I think that's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. You know, it's so exciting, and it's such a great gift for children to kind of have that in these times, especially. You know, and you sort of mentioned about lockdown and how books and libraries, that whole sense of community has been so important in drawing people together. So I'm really, really excited for that. And yeah, I'm just a general kind of shout out for libraries, because they're such special places with librarians. It's kind of like a safe haven. It's somewhere where people feel they can go and find amazing stories, and a story that's kind of special for them, just like I found this one and all my kind of Greek myths. So yeah,
thank you, Jazz, that was brilliant.
Thank you.
And don't tell anybody else, but I still look in every wardrobe in the hope I'll find my way into Narnia. So that's our secret. So
yeah.
well, Our next speaker, author, is the incomparable Philip Ardagh. Philip's written over 100 fiction and non-fiction books for children and adults. His first book in the Grubtown series, Stinking Rich and Just Plain Stinky, won the Roald Dahl Funny Prize. He's been published in 40 languages, and he's well known for his award-winning Eddie Dickens books, his Grunt series, his Stick and Fetch series, and his latest series, The 9 Lives of Furry Purry Bean Cat, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. He collaborated with Paul McCartney on the ex-Beatles' first children's book, High in the Clouds. He's a mega Moomin fan, and last year he wrote a definitive 380-page guide published by Macmillan. In October 2019, he was appointed as the only lifetime ambassador for the School Libraries Group in recognition of his strong and loyal support and advocacy for school and public libraries. He's known as the bearded one, though I'm not quite sure why. And before embarking on a writing course, he also worked in a library service. So welcome, Philip, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Annie. In the past, I've done, I think, whole events for you based around books from my childhood. And I think most of you know by now my love of libraries. So today I thought I'd do something a little different. I thought I'd tell you a story based around the time I worked, as you just mentioned, as a highly unqualified library assistant back in the 1980s. I'd already worked as a writer in a West End advertising agency, and by then I'd retired and become a hospital cleaner, and I was working in a library. Downham Library was at the top of a hill on Downham Way, surrounded by brick-built houses of the 1920s and 30s in what's now the London Borough of Lewisham. And at the outset, it was considered a garden estate to rehouse a number of families from the slums of the East End of London. And the idea wasn't popular with some of the homeowners in more affluent Bromley. So they decided it'd be a good idea to build a wall. Does that sound familiar? Across one end of the main road. And this was no token wall. It was 7 feet high, with cement along the top with bits of broken glass in it. And this was to prevent the incomers of the new Downham estate from using it as a quick route into town. What a lovely welcome that was. Anyway, after the war, the estate grew and many families were rehoused from bombed out London, obviously the Blitz. And to many people, the Downham estate really did seem like a home in the country because it had open spaces. And they were rather attractive little brick-built semis, not as your pebble-dashed council house you might think of today. And at its heart, built back in 1937, stood Downham Library, and just behind it the swimming baths. And the war was still raging when the library was built. And just in an 8-month period between 1940 and 1941, 62 bombs just in that period were dropped on Downham. And the library was there at the heart of it, and life went on. The most awful moment for Downham came in World War II, when a German plane flew down Downham Way, the main road, so low that many eyewitnesses actually reported seeing the pilot in the cockpit, and he was machine gunning anything he could see, anything that moved, anything in his path. And reaching the bottom of the hill, he pulled up the plane and he dropped bombs on Sandhurst Road School. And numerous eyewitnesses reported seeing that the plane looped around the school with the pilot waving at the children in the playground before dropping a single 500-kilogram bomb. And of those killed, 31 of the children and one of the teachers were buried in a mass grave nearby. As for the wall dividing the posh and Downham's lesser folk, that remained in place till 1950. And I came to work at the library in the late 1980s, beardless, tall and thin in those days. And members of staff changed over time, but one constant was Fred the caretaker with his swept-back white hair and his big, thick black frame glasses. He was a cooper, a barrel maker by trade, and he'd been in the Royal Navy during the war. And one of the lasting memories he had was he was on one of the ships that brought back the Japanese prisoners of war, the English Japanese prisoners of war. And they were obviously some of the most cruelly treated prisoners of war on any side in the conflict. And he was haunted by these living skeletons. It was something he'd never forget. And one snowy winter, about a year after I'd started there as a highly unqualified library assistant, Fred was trudging on his way to the side entrance of the library to open up for the staff when he saw 5 fluffy pink whatever they were sticking up out of the snow. So he went to investigate, and he gripped one of them and he pulled it, and he found himself holding the half-frozen trunk of a cuddly pink elephant, and it'd been on its back with 4 paws and a trunk in the air. And Fred looked at the elephant, and the elephant looked at the caretaker, and Fred took him inside. And once the library elephant had thawed out and dried, he became a regular face around the library. For starters, he became a he, and he had the name I just mentioned, library elephant. And if you sat the elephant in a chair, he was a bit floppy and inclined to slide down. He took up most of it. So although he was small for an elephant, library elephant was pretty big for a cuddly toy. And I was often the first member of staff in after Fred had opened up each morning, and I'd invariably find the library elephant in different spots around the library, sitting at the inquirer's desk, behind the counter, lounging in the staff room, invariably with an empty cup of coffee mug by him. And I'd always chuckle and make comments to Fred, and he'd always insist that he hadn't put the library elephant there. Unless he was claimed by a child, it was clear that the library elephant was here to stay. It was Fred, by the way, who told the children that the elephants in the large pictures around the walls of the children's library came to life at night and came down and played all around the children's library, that always helped tidy up afterwards. And Fred had been due to retire a few years previously and spend more time in his allotment and with his wife, but tragically, no sooner had he retired than his wife died. So he could see no reason to spend time at home without her, so he returned, and retirement's loss was Downham Library's gain. One morning I arrived early at the library, as usual, to be greeted by the sight of an ambulance with blue light flashing, the back door open, and then out came Fred on a stretcher, red blanket over him, strapped in place, oxygen mask in his face, and he was loaded into the back of the ambulance. And there's a policewoman there chatting to some of the locals who had come to see what the commotion was. And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "They think he's had a heart attack. They found him on the floor." And I said, "Well, how did they find him?" And they said, "Well, someone dialed 999. So I looked around for the other member of the staff who must have got in earlier than me unusually, and there was no sign of anybody. So I went inside, and as the ambulance went away, but it would have to be business as usual. Although Fred had this heart attack, I knew that we would still have to open the library at 9 o'clock. So I went in and I was calling out, "Hello, hi," to whoever it was who found him. And there was no one there, except, of course, for the library elephant. No empty coffee cup in front of him that morning. He was just simply sitting by the telephone. Now, Fred made a full recovery, I'm happy to report. It might have been very different if someone hadn't called for the ambulance. The old library is long since gone now and been replaced with the leisure centre cum library complex. To this day, no one knows who made that call. But I have my suspicions because, you see, I'm a firm believer that no kind deed is ever wasted. And that's my library story for you today.
That's a wonderful library story. That will stay with me, the library elephant. I wonder how many more libraries out there have got similar library elephants. Thank you so much, Philip. Can I move on to our next speaker, who is Caroline Roche. Caroline has been a school librarian for over 20 years in 4 different secondary schools. She's an enthusiastic user of technology. She's an occasional blogger. She's currently chair of the SILIP School Libraries Group and chair of the Great School Libraries Group. She presents to school librarians and teachers on how to use technology to enthuse students about reading and how the new media can be used to encourage reading. Most of all, she's a brilliant advocate for school libraries and for books, and she herself loves to read, and we've had many great book discussions. So over to you, Caroline.
First of all, when Annie said about a book, I thought, oh, I can't really do that because I've always loved books and I couldn't pick on any one book at all that's influenced me. I don't even remember learning to read. I, as far as I'm concerned, I've always been able to read. I know that's not true, but I can't even remember learning to read. I've always read. And for me, reading is like inhaling. When I get towards the end of a book, maybe 3/4 through, I have to make sure that there's another book there waiting for me, because I get really, really itchy if there isn't a book waiting for me. It's almost like, it's like chain smoking, but it's chain books. And one of my very first thoughts going into lockdown was a terrible fright that I would not have enough books, because as it happened, I had been ill for the week before lockdown and I'd been home. So unlike most other librarians, I wasn't able to go into school and grab a whole pile of books. I was stuck at home. But luckily, Annie arranges wonderful proofs from authors, so I managed to keep myself going, reading proofs, because, oh my word, the thought was awful. So this was the first library that I remember. Right, so East Horsley, I was born in India. In fact, I was born in what was Calcutta and then moved to Bombay, because my parents were out there. But we came back to this country when I was 11, and we lived in a little village called East Horsley, which is near Guildford. So from 11, that's where I was. And this was my library, East Horsley branch. And it was a very little library, but it was wonderful for me. We used to go once a week. My dad would go into the village and do other stuff, and we were allowed to go to the library. And well, my parents had 6 children, so we couldn't afford to keep up my book habit. So the library was the place. And in this library, I very soon, like Annie, graduated, because I was 11, to being able to read the adult books. And I just loved it. I would be there all the time if I could, and I just take home piles of books. And one of the series I really loved was Jean Plaidy. I know she's an older author now, but Jean Plaidy wrote a whole series on the kings and queens of England. And it started, I don't know, somewhere around about maybe Matilda, maybe it was William the Conqueror, but somewhere quite early, or even earlier than that, I'm not sure. But then she just carried on the sweep of history. And I read my way through from wherever it started, all the kings and queens, and including, Commonwealth, Oliver Cromwell, just read their stories all the way through to something like Victorian times. And the one thing that gave me, I remember, was a real sense of the sweep of history, which I kept. And I always think it's a shame that, in schools we're taught history, but as disconnected periods. So you might be learning about the Romans and you learn about World War I and World War II, and there's no connecting sweep. But Jean Plaidy gave me an idea of the way that everything connected all the way through. And I think that was one of my most influential authors around that time. And so this was my little library. The other thing I like doing is that when I visited my grandma and granddad at Headington near Oxford, and when I stayed there, and I stayed there quite a lot because from the ages of 8 till 11, my parents were still in India, but I was at a boarding school here in England. So for Easter holidays, I used to stay the 2 weeks with my grandparents because it was too far to, it wasn't too far to fly back, but I only saw my parents at Christmas and summer holidays, and all the other holidays and half terms I was with my grandparents here at Oxford. And so I used to go with my grandma to Headington Library, and it's in this very posh house, and it was part of, I don't know how it is, but it was part of this stately house, and it was beautiful, all old wood. So my first library, my own library, wasn't beautiful, but I loved it. But this was a beautiful library. So I think there's the first, very few other libraries I've been in and had any connection with have been beautiful. But this was a special library, and I was allowed to borrow books on Grandma's ticket for the holidays and have them, and I absolutely loved it. My third library was Shepway Library, which is a big council estate in Maidstone, Kent, which is where I live. So after I'd married and I had my kids, I gravitated to Shepway Library, which is very small. In fact, in reflection of the glass at the back there, you can see the shelves along the back. So it's a very tiny library. But I used to just visit it, and once my daughter was coming up for 5, I visited it one day, and there was a notice in the window that said assistant librarian wanted. So I applied, and I got the job. It was only part-time, but I had someone who could look after my daughter for that. So it was just a couple of mornings a week, but I absolutely fell in love with the job. And there's where I was taught. I worked there for 5 years, and I learned the craft of being a librarian. So I learned the nuts and bolts, because I hadn't, in spite of there being librarians working in East Horsley Library, I don't know why I hadn't connected it with thinking about that as a career. I just had not connected it. And no one in school, we didn't get careers advice when I was at school. If you were going to university, you didn't get careers advice. You only got careers advice. So I went to university and did an English degree. So no one had ever suggested that I could actually be an I could be a librarian. So I did English, which was the next thing to what I loved. So when I came here, it's the first time I've actually been a librarian. And like I said, I adored it. But what I liked doing most was when the teenagers came in after school, they came to do their homework, and I used to love helping them. But none of the other librarians, there were about 3 or 4 of us on the rota. Everyone else stayed away from them. Oh, kids, teenagers, they really dislike. And I was drawn to them, and they were like, oh, please, no. So I have a real sort of affinity for working with teenagers, however sort of loud they were. And they were quite loud on that estate. It was quite a rough estate. But I lived there, so they knew me. And then a job in the local school to this one came up, and I went for it. And I remember going to the interview, and I'd been told by other staff at Maidstone Library, because Kent was very hierarchical, very then. You know, assistant librarians didn't go for proper librarian jobs, and I was often told off for answering questions because I wasn't a proper librarian. Questions about poetry and things that, like, I knew because I had an English degree, but they were very hierarchical. So I was criticised a lot for going for this job, but I was going to go anyways. And then when the head interviewed me, he said, well, you haven't got a lot of experience. And I said, well, no, but I have a degree in English, and I've been working in this local branch library, and I like working with teenagers. And he said, okay, I'll take you on, but it's a year's temporary contract, and we'll see how you do. And I said, fine, I'll prove it. I'll prove you, because I respond to challenges like that. It's my sort of thing. So I took this job. After 6 months, I said to him, I think, do you think you're going to make this permanent? And he said, oh, yes, no problem at all. So from there, that was my first library. And it was built from scratch, because they'd got the furniture in the room, but nothing else. So they wanted someone to build it up. So I put all the craft that I'd learnt from being a librarian in Shepway, and then learnt everything else from start, got chartered as soon as I could, through the early slip route, which they called Route B at the time. When they first opened it up to people without a library degree, I was in there. I was not first, but I was among the first, like straight away, this is my career. And that's it. I've stayed being a school librarian ever since. This is my 4th school I'm in. Absolutely adore the job. I couldn't even imagine doing anything better. Moving to a different type of library, it's not me. School libraries are just perfect for me. So that's my library story.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, I think I love listening to other people's stories about their library route, because in some ways we're all very different, and in some ways there's that thread of passion about libraries and books that run along. Can I now introduce our next author speaker, Bally Rye? Bally's a very well-known, award-winning and hugely popular voice within the young adult fiction market, and his popularity within the middle grade fiction field is growing rapidly, with books like Tales from India and Now or Never, which is on the 2020 shortlist for the Little Rebels Award. All of his teen titles have been shortlisted for awards across the UK. His first novel for young adults, Unarranged Marriage, won a number of awards, including the Angus Book Award and the Leicester Book Award, and it was shortlisted for the prestigious Branford Bowes First Novel Award. His novel, Killing Honour, won the North East Teen Book Award, and Rani and Suk became a set text for GCS English. And one of my favourites is his, which you may not have necessarily come across, but if you haven't, do read it. It's from the collection Memories of Home. In the Home, his story is called Memories of Home in the Home Again collection, celebrating the 75th anniversary of VE Day. So over to you, Bally.
There you go. I thought I'd give you a little prop there.
I love that. Love it.
If you haven't seen this is fantastic. It kind of so it's 50p from every copy is donated to the British Legion, and we've just done a load of resources for schools. So you can go onto the website and look at them. They're absolutely fantastic. So yeah, very pleased with that. I'm libraries. Always been a big fan of libraries. I'm a product of libraries. I say this all the time. And I've spoken about libraries, and particularly the most sort of influential author on me, which was Sue Townsend, so much that it feels like I'm sort of just, it's just there. I can just talk about it. But rather than talk about Sue, Sue was amazing. If it wasn't for Sue Townsend, I don't think I would have ever realised that you didn't have to be basically, and I'm going to be blunt, old and posh and white or dead and posh and white to be an author. Sue was this, regular woman from a regular place in Leicester, whose kids went to pretty much two of them went to every school in Leicester because they got kicked out of every other one. She was just like a regular mum. But for me, my library journey started with my dad. My dad spent a lot of time. He died when I was 14, and from the moment I was born up until the age of 14, he spent a lot of time being very sick and then being okay and then being very sick. But he worked in a plastics factory, and he was a member of the Indian Workers Association, which was, I believe, affiliated to the Communist Party of Great Britain. So he was a bit of a lefty, to put it mildly. And there was a guy at his workplace that my mum told me about later, who told him that the government didn't care about educating poor people, and that the only way that me and my sister's a year older, would do better as sort of in our lives, which is exactly what immigrant parents want for their kids when they migrate to new countries, is to get us to read, because we wouldn't gain anywhere near the right level of education in school. Much of school was important, and I don't think my dad ever really understood that. I think he just decided that he'd take us on a Saturday morning to a library, leave us there, basically go away for a few hours, go and do shopping or whatever, and come back. So there were three for me. The first one was Highfields Library in the centre of Leicester, which is Highfields and North Evington, was the area I grew up in originally, and then, or at first. And then there was St Barnabas, which was on the edge of North Evington. So we had these two libraries. And I don't know if any of you know Leicester. I'm not sure if there are any other libraries of this type, but Leicester has two, Southfields and St Barnabas, which we in Leicester call pork pie libraries because of the pork pie link. But they've basically got rotundas that sit in the middle. Amazing buildings. So I had a great time going in, and I wasn't, like Anthony mentioned earlier, I wasn't really into fiction to begin with. I was into non-fiction, but it was through the kind of the understanding and help of the librarians that were there that they started talking to me about what I was into. So it was Roald Dahl and C.S. Lewis, and it was, as I got a bit older, Sue Townsend that I mentioned. I was a massive fan of S.E. Hinton. She's a big influence on my writing, or certainly was when I started. Lady of the Outsiders. I believe she was 17 when she had that published. Douglas Adams, all these people. But the library itself became kind of not just a haven, it became kind of the place that I went to learn things. And my school library was, it was a school library in the 1980s and a bog standard comprehensive that nobody really wanted to send their kids to. The librarian did her best, but it wasn't a particularly well regarded library by the majority of the adults in the school. We were just thrown in there. And although she did her best, she only had one book which featured non-white characters, and that was Come to Mecca by Farooq Dondi, a collection of short stories. And Farooq is still one of my favourite writers to this day because of that. But she'd kind of just forget and go, "Oh, have you read this?" And you'd be like, "Yeah, only 10 times now." Much as I enjoyed rereading those stories, I was looking for more. And going into Highfields Library, particularly in St Barnabas, because of the nature of Leicester's multiculturalism, we are the most multicultural place anywhere in the UK. Even back then, there was a call for books from more diverse voices and with more diverse characters. There weren't many of them about, but the ones that were about were the ones that I managed to access. So I accessed, some great writing. Alex Haley, and the sort of co-written autobiography of Malcolm X, which is another massive influence on my early life and still now. James Baldwin. There was all kinds of different people, and this stuff was being given to me by these librarians who were like, "Look here," and I'd say, "I want to be a writer," and they'd be like, "Well," and I remember saying to one, "I don't think people like me don't become authors," and she just laughed and she went, "Well, you'll have to do it first then, won't you?" And they were really supportive, really friendly, really intelligent, really, really, really so kind of knowledgeable about so much that my love for libraries never ever faded. And I've got to a point now where, like many of us, I think every one of us that's involved here today, and everyone viewing, where the anger at library closures and the way school libraries and librarians are being treated just grows every year. So it's really important that we support them, and I think it's really important that we get out into schools virtually at the moment, and when we go back to doing it physically, and actually talk actively about libraries and the importance of them. So something like this is fantastic. But for me, it was basically 3 libraries in Leicester. My dad's kind of, I think, just wanting to get rid of me and my sister. Just you sit there, I'll be back in a minute. And the librarians were wonderful and let him do that. Different days, the 70s, they'd struggle to do that now, I think. And just sitting there and discovering things. And it wasn't just, people that looked like me or my best mate who was from a black Jamaican heritage. It was white working class kids as well. It was women. It was, you name it. It was about reading as much as I could. And these librarians, these amazing, amazing people were just there going, "You've read that? Have you tried this? You've read that now? Have you tried this? And here's a few more." And so my experience of literature grew. And I've always said this, people like me from my family, most of my family don't read. Most of my family of my generation didn't even really care about school. They just wanted to get out and work and all the rest of it, have their own businesses. So what I do is quite weird for my family. And that weirdness, I'm very, very grateful for. That kind of black sheep status that I had for a long while, I'm very grateful for. And that all came from libraries. And I'll be grateful to libraries and librarians until the day I pop my clogs. Wonderful places, wonderful people, and we need more of them.
Thank you, Bally. I'm going to move swiftly on to Beverly Naidu, our next speaker. Beverly was exiled from her home country of South Africa when she was a student in 1965 for campaigning against apartheid. Her first novel, Journey to Joburg, was banned in South Africa when it was published in 1985 and only available there after the release of Nelson Mandela from jail in 1991. It was, however, published in many other countries and, as you know, hugely successful for its eloquent, moving and accessible story and for the issues it raises. She's written a number of YA novels, including The Other Side of Truth, which won the Carnegie Medal. She's also written for younger children, including a wonderful retelling of the world's oldest Cinderella tale, Cinderella of the Nile. She's also written an adult book, Death of an Idealist, the story behind the only white detainee to die in the custody of South Africa's apartheid security police. And do read it if you haven't. So welcome, Beverly. Can I hand over to you?
Well, what an interesting set of experiences to follow from. And so thank you all. Well, I'm going to be, I think, possibly the first here who's going to say that actually it wasn't the library, because my library at school was shut. This is my library at my convent school in 1950s, Joburg. And I don't know what they had in there, except years later I met a boarder who was at the same school, and she said, you didn't miss much, because they mostly were improving lives of saints. But I remember looking through, and I don't know if this is a false or false memory, but I seem to remember looking through very dusty panes and just seeing very dusty books. But I can't ever remember being allowed into that library. And in my final year in school, and remember, this is actually the year when Sharpeville, there's been a massacre at Sharpeville. And again, as this young white person, I've got no notion of this. In fact, I've seen the nuns running for the very first time ever. And we're young ladies and not meant to run. And basically, they were saying that black people were coming to Joburg and that they were coming to attack us. And they were worried, are they going to keep us in school or get us home? But anyway, that library, which had remained shut, I went to the vice principal that year and I asked her if she would sign, I think she had to co-sign my application to join Johannesburg City Library. And again, I don't think it passed my mind that this was a library that was only, for people of my color skin. But, she refused. And she said, and what would you be wanting to read more books for, Beverly? Do you not have enough with your textbooks already? And I think it finally spurred me on. In retrospect, I think that spurred me. What was it that they didn't want me to read? But it was really only the following year when I got into university and they'd passed something called the Extension of Universities Act, which did the very opposite. So they'd said no longer black students can no longer come to the Witwatersrand University. It's now a white university. But there were still a few black students there. And somehow I am very fortunate, luckily, I was introduced to a group of students on the lawn outside the library. And this was a group of students, black and white students. And there were the very best discussions that were taking place. And what the book, but actually, what I've realized now, I've just jumped over entirely, because the one thing I should have said is while I was at school, I did have a bookshelf at home. And I did have a few books. And one of them was this fairy tales, the Andrew Langs. You can see that's my inside of the copy there of the Andrew Lang fairy tales. And so that was part of the European bubble, really. Except in fact, very recently, I've been reading Jack Zipes on fairy tales. And what Jack Zipes says is that fairy tales arise out of age-old struggles to humanize bestial and barbaric forces, threatening to destroy free will and human compassion. And I think maybe that perhaps did, it did lead me in some way. I don't know, it left a trace. And the other book that I should have said that I completely forgot to mention is The Diary of Anne Frank. That this book kind of spoke to me in a way. Yes, it was still part of this European bubble, but it spoke to me because my mom was Jewish. And I kind of thought, my goodness, here I was born a permitted, I would say, in South Africa. But had I been born in Europe, I would have been a non. I would have not been one of the permitteds. And that, again, I loved her voice. She was the kind of things that she would say. She was very critical of adults, and I was a timid child, but she was very critical of adults. But she would also kind of talk about the wider world. And she'd say, why do some people have to starve while there are surpluses in other parts of the world, rotting in other parts of the world? Oh, why are people so crazy? And again, I think it might have planted a seed in me, because when I got to that university, I somehow was ready for something. There's the library having been closed, and I was introduced to this group. A friend took and introduced me into this group of, and the fact that they were talking about real life, and in that group, then, you can see they're down Second Avenue. And I can't remember who it was, but someone passed me this book. Down Second Avenue, at that stage, he was called Ezekiel Mpishlele, Eskia Mpishlele, he is. And, you know, it was a memoir of growing up. I mean, he was only in his 40s then. It was a memoir of growing up and he'd grown up about 30 miles away from where I lived, in Marabastad, but it could have been on another planet. And I have to say this book was banned, because this book had been published in the GDR, which was part of Behind the Iron Curtain. It was, you know, this was communist East Germany, and it was a banned book. But, you know, that book, the kind of impact, there's this other world. How come I don't know any of this? And that then kind of led on to a whole process, and to jump a few years. By my final year in university, Nelson Mandela and his comrades, they were arrested. The Rivonia trialists, they were on trial. And, you know, here was kind of life in a way taking over. And I ended up, after that, I ended up for a short period in detention. And a few months later came into exile. And the person who, very casually, there was Professor Harry Ray, and he had been part of the French resistance. You know, he was later to be the head teacher of Watford Grammar and Michael Rosen's head teacher, but he'd been dropped into France and been part of the French resistance, and he was an education professor at the New University of York. And he said very casually, he said to me, "Have you read L'Enfant Noir, the African Child, Kamara Lai?" He actually wrote it in the letter, you know, it was a letter, and also Edward Blishen's Roaring Boys. And suddenly, so I immediately got them. And it's, my goodness, so education isn't what I had at school. You know, education could be about culture. It could be about class. And that kind of really shifted me. I'm thinking, okay, I'll study education. And in time, in due course, I became a teacher. And in due course, I wanted to then I began writing. And then I then began to think, well, what do people read? When they read, I was getting letters, but, you know, I could see their differences in the kind of responses I'm getting. So how do we read? What are the lenses through which we read? And how are they different? So I set up a research project around that. And this book just had to be part of it, The Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, because it had made such an impact on me. I'd begun now reading African-American writers, and I'd read, and then also reading African-American writers who were writing for YA, and come across Mildred Taylor. And my goodness, you know, she hit me in the gut. This is South Africa, I knew it, you know, what she was talking about, making the connections. And anyway, I continued, I returned to my writing. But so, you know, it's, I suppose, fine, I could say, if I just show you that, you know, that you could see there, that was one of the books. It just had to be part of this research project, which was actually with children who saw themselves as part of an all-white environment. And, yeah, so thank you. Interesting how our journeys are so different, but here we are together. And isn't that wonderful?
It is, very much so. Thank you, Beverly. Do you want to stop sharing yours? That's brilliant. Thank you. Can I now introduce Savita Kalhan to you, who got the writing bug when she was teaching in the Middle East, where she lived for several years. She writes for teenagers and young adults, thinks up her ideas in her allotment, and runs a teenage reading group at her local library in Finchley. And she's credited by that library for raising interest in reading among teenagers and causing a shoot up in the borrowing figures. Her book, The Girl in the Broken Mirror, was nominated for the Philip Carnegie Medal, and her latest book, That Asian Kid, is a nail-biting story of what happens when a boy sees two of his teachers doing something they shouldn't be in the woods by the school and films it. Over to you, Savita.
Hi, thank you, Annie. Thank you for inviting me to talk about things I'm very passionate about, books and libraries. So I'm going to share the story of why I'm so passionate about books and libraries. I was born in India, but I came to the UK when I was very young. English was not my first language. Growing up as an Asian girl in High Wycombe was challenging. My parents were poor. My parents were very strict and very traditional. My mum was illiterate in her own language as well as in English, as she never had the chance to go to school when she was growing up. My parents worked very hard, so we rarely went hungry, but books were a luxury that we really couldn't afford. But for my parents, education was synonymous with books and reading. For them, education was the key to success. It was the key to overcoming prejudice and racism. So they made every effort to take us to the library. And I was lucky because High Wycombe had an amazing children's library. And I pretty much read the entire contents of the library. I read all of Roald Dahl's books. I read Enchanted Wood and The Magic Faraway Tree. I read The Children of Green Knowe, Ballet Shoes, Anne of Green Gables. I mean, just everything. I just loved reading. I was passionate about it. It was the Hobbit and the Narnia books and Ursula Le Guin that gave me my passion for fantasy, which lasts until this day. So when I had finished reading all the books in the children's library, I went knocking on the door of the adult library next door, and I met a librarian there, Mrs. Stevens, who was quite stern, quite formidable, and I kind of wanted to run away, but I stood my ground and I asked for The Lord of the Rings. I know a few of us have mentioned The Lord of the Rings today, but I asked for The Lord of the Rings because I had finished reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was in the adult library. She said that no, I couldn't join the library. I was too young to come back when I was 14. So I was devastated, but it didn't put me off. I went back and I bugged her until she let me borrow The Lord of the Rings. And then I asked her for The Quaker Wakes because I was reading John Wyndham, and she allowed me to borrow that. And then when I went back, she gave me an adult library card, but said that she would vet my books for a while, which she did. But pretty soon she allowed me to borrow anything I wanted, and I worked my way around the adult library in the same way as I had with the children's library, reading everything from classics to contemporary, historical, crime. I read everything by Agatha Christie. I read all the Perry Mason books. I read lots of horror, lots of that I shouldn't have been reading. I read, I think, Dennis Wheatley and all sorts. I read late into the night. No one vetted my books. No one read aloud to me. And I had freedom of choice, which was the most amazing thing, I think, when I was a teenager. That complete freedom of choice to read exactly what I want and as much as I wanted and as late as I wanted because no one was checking on me. So my parents were working very hard. In the 90s, yeah, as Annie said, I went to teach English in Jeddah, and there was only one bookshop which sold English language books, and I was gutted. So I would come back from my holidays in the UK with my suitcase full of books and cross my fingers that none of them were taken away at the airport because books were vetted by the Ministry of Information. Luckily, I didn't lose too many books to the Saudi censors. I was going through a phase of reading fantasy epics again, my first love. And as you know, lots of those books run to 3 books a series, often many more. And some of the series were disappointing. So my friend and I decided that we might try a hand at writing one. Well, to cut a long story short, I started the first chapter, I built the world, I started writing the book, and she was never ready to write the next chapter. So I continued writing until I had written 600,000 words by hand in many, many notebooks. She read all of the words, but she actually never wrote a single one. And when I came back to the UK, I started transcribing them to the PC and editing as I went along. And I think that's how I started on my road to being a writer. And I attribute that to my parents because I discovered the pleasure and the power of reading at such a young age because of them. My childhood love of libraries also led to me starting up this teen reading group. It was supposed to be for 12 to 15-year-olds at my local library. So I went in and had a chat with the librarian, Steve, who is a wonderful librarian. And he said, well, they weren't getting that many teenagers in. He wasn't sure how it would work. So we started it. I started it with three kids. It soon grew to 20 or more children, and the age range shifted from 10 to 18, which is a huge age range for a reading group. So how did that work? It was tough at the beginning, but my librarian was really, really helpful in getting lots of choice of books for them. And actually, the older teenagers then would recommend books to the younger ones, and the younger ones wanted to read faster to catch up with the older ones. So it was actually a really good thing for all of them. And then when the younger ones started secondary school, the older ones gave them advice and tips, and they were really helpful with them. So it turned into a big support network as well. Sadly, my local library now only allows children to come in one day after school a week, and that breaks my heart. I think, and unless they're accompanied by an adult, and I think most parents are obviously working, so they're not going to be able to take their kids in at 4 o'clock after school. My local library was the place where I discovered so many new worlds, amazing stories. It opened my mind. It was a place of safety for me. It was at times a place of refuge. So I'm really, really passionate that children continue having access to books, and that libraries don't close, and they don't miss out on everything that I had. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Beverly said, lots of different journeys, but underpinning threads that bind us all together. So I thought it would be fun to close this Libraries Week celebration event with some poetry about books, reading, libraries, and I couldn't think of anyone better to do this but Paul Cookson, our poet extraordinaire. He's got a way with words, and his poetry appeals to all ages. He can have children and adults rolling in the aisles with poems like Mum Used Pritt Stick and Where People Keep Their Pets. Or he can inspire them with poems like one of my personal favourites, Let No One Steal Your Dreams. Or get us all thinking about more serious issues with poems like those he's been writing and posting throughout lockdown, which have just been published as a collection called Fighting Talk, illustrated by Chris Riddell. He's written over 60 books, has sold well over 750,000 books, and his poems have appeared in over 200 other books. He's got lots of other accolades, like Poet in Residence for the National Football Museum. He was a national reading hero as part of the National Year of Reading. But what I want to do is to hand over to him and let him give us some of his words. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. As you said, I've got away with words for over 30 years now, so that's been very good. And I've been remembering a couple of stories about my own school library while people have been talking, the sort of recollections. Because when I was at primary school, we didn't have actually a library building or a library room. It was like some boxes that were opened every Monday night after school, and like 2 suitcases, and you just pick something off the shelves. I remember the first poem I ever liked picking off the shelf there. That was Alfred Noyes' Daddy Fell Into the Pond. And when I came to edit books later on, it was one of the poems that I put in there. The only other memory I have of I think when I was a junior, we had a library that was actually inside the school, up some stairs. And the only recollection I have is of opening some sort of artistic book and saying something intellectual like, "Oh, bare bums," at which point this little lad came over, ripped the book out of my hand and tore the book in half. So my other recollection of the library is vandalising a book because of the word bare bums, and then lying to the head teacher about what was actually said and how it was an accident. We're both art lovers or whatever it was. Anyway, that's nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about now. 20 years ago, this book came out, which is The Works, a collection of poems, and I was promoting it at a couple of events at Hay Festival, and Julie Donaldson was there. Because she was published by Macmillan as well. So we're having a meal one night, and my wife was there, and my daughter was only, sort of less than 1 year old at the time and suffering from colic. So throughout the meal, we got to talk about the different ways you get children to sleep. I said the amount of hours I've spent walking the pram round the streets or driving out in the middle of the night, all those things. And Julia said, we do the same things. We take the pram out. And then she said, and this stuck with me for about 18 years, and I wrote this poem. She said, we put the baby in the pram in the middle of the night, but we'd never take them out of the house. They'd take all the books off the shelf, put them on the hall floor, and then because the books were at different levels, they'd roll the pram over the books. And that rocking motion would set the children to sleep. And it just stuck with me. And so I wrote this poem called Books at Bedtime. There have always been books at bedtime. Even as babies, colic afflicted, restless, coughing and crying. There have always been those books, especially for that bedtime reading. The Bible, the Beano, Encyclopedia Britannica, Treasure Island, The Dandy, Dickens, Dahl, and the rest. Classics from every shelf. Stories from a different childhood. Thick, slim, the big, the small, the in-between. Illustrated picture books, sumptuous colours, black and white lines, comic creations. All books at bedtime, lulling the insomniac infant. Not just the reading of these million words, the telling of these 1,000 stories, or the rhymes of a myriad lines, or the rhythms of this children's garden of verse, as thick and thin lie side by side, arranged on the hall floor. Literally, a literary cobbled street, for a pram to undulate upon. The rock and the roll of the wheels upon the words, the to and the fro of the springs upon the stories, the osmosis of gentle lullabies as words sing through the pages in this secret midnight garden where a parent strolls perambulating on those special bedtime books on the long, 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 long road to Slumberland. And the wheels on the books go round and round, and the wheels on the books go round and round, and the wheels on the books go round and round all night long. Open a book and you open the world. Open a new book, you find a new world. A world within words, within words, within words. Taste the freedom of adventure and run wild and free. Open a book and you open your mind. Close a book and you close your mind. Unlock the secrets, embrace the magic. Let each turning page colour our imagination. Run free, run wild and free with new friends to love and cherish. New friends to share experiences with. New friends to teach you. Learn from their stories. Learn from their lives. Learn from their mistakes and learn from their loves. No one is ever freed by grammar. Subjunctive clauses, prepositions, suffixes, fronted adverbials would only be exciting if there were monsters to escape from, which in a way they are. But stories, they free our hearts and they free our minds. The confines of the pages are universes to explore. No one, and I mean no one, has ever needed a semicolon. But a good story is a friend forever. So run free, revel in those stories, dance along to their music, sing the adventures, cry the emotions, laugh the danger away. All life is here. There is joy in them, their pages. A good story is a friend forever and ever and ever. Amen. And the last poem I'm going to read to you is called A Favourite Book and a Comfy Chair. And there was always been books around us as a child, mostly sort of Bible stories, because my dad was a Methodist lay preacher, so we always had Bible stories, hence the Bible here. And he was a member of a book club, so we had things like Treasure Island and The Three Musketeers and stuff like that. But as a teenager, I got into poetry, and my two favourite books are up here. The two most influential books in my life have been this one here, The Mersey Sound, Roger McGough, Brian Patton and Adrian Henry, especially Roger McGough, and this book here, 10 Years and Then Open Next Shirt, the poems of John Cooper Clarke, because these were the two people who, Roger McGough was the first poet who maybe wanted to write poems, and I suppose John Cooper Clarke was the first poet who maybe wanted to perform poems. So in terms of favourite books, these are two of my favourite books, but I've got lots of favourite books and we could talk for hours on those. Many of you have mentioned them already. But this is called A Favourite Book and a Comfy Chair. And often when I perform this in schools or libraries, when you've got an audience there, you get to join in with a comfy chair. So if you want to, wherever you are, you can just join in with a favourite book and a comfy chair. I just can't wait to be with you. Time flies by when you are there. You take me to another place. A favourite book
and a comfy chair.
You fill my head with images and feelings I can't wait to share. You touch all my emotions. A favourite book
and a comfy
chair. And where you go, I'll follow. You can take me anywhere. Horizons disappear with you. A favourite book
and a comfy chair.
A favourite book and a comfy chair. Thank you very much, Yanni. Lovely to be part of such a wonderful event. Lovely to hear all the stories. More power to yourself and the librarians and the libraries out there. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. What can I say, folks? I know we've overrun a little, but I see you've all stayed with us, and I'm very glad about that, because we have had a fabulous evening. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. Hope you've been inspired by our speakers and their love of books. And I know I am going to reread some of those which were favourites of mine that have now been talked about. And that's the beauty, isn't it, of what we do, the fact that we are able to share our love of books and stories and read things that other people recommend and carry on our reading journey. I don't think there are any questions. I couldn't see any, but some really lovely comments which we'll share with our authors when we've finished. In bringing this evening to a close, I just want to say a few thanks. Thanks to Bev and Naomi in the background, looking at the tech and just keeping an eye on things. Thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight and staying with us, because it is about celebrating our libraries, and it is about celebrating our librarians, and it's also celebrating the tools that we have to work with, the books and the amazing writers that we've got here tonight. Thanks to Silip and to Natalie for working in partnership with us, and for all the things that Silip do to support libraries and librarians during the course, particularly this year, of what's been a very, very rocky year. We do have some future events coming up. We have a launch event for Catherine Doyle's new book, Miracle on Ebenezer Street, which is her modern retelling of A Christmas Carol, which will be on the 15th of October at 7 o'clock. Look out on social media for the link to register for that. As I say, don't forget also to post a photo of the books that have shaped your life with the hashtag Express Your Shelf. Wherever you are at the moment, be it with a coffee or a glass of bubbly, raise that glass and let's clap and say thank you to all you wonderful librarians and our wonderful library service. So I hope to see you all again at a future event. Thanks a lot. Bye.